Today's conversation with music attorney Cassandra Spangler is about LLCs. What is an LLC and why it may be in your best interest to register your music business as an LLC. Before we do that, though, we'd like to thank Zencaster for providing the platform for our conversation and remind you that the information provided in this video is for informational purposes only and not for the purpose of providing legal advice. You should contact an attorney to obtain advice with respect to any particular issue or problem. We are once again with Miss Cassandra Spangler, and Cassandra is an attorney. She's a music attorney. We have had many conversations together, Cassandra, and we've talked about a lot of different things. We've touched on the thing we're going to be talking about today, which is almost setting up your business, whether you're going to choose an LLC or you're going to do a sole proprietorship or a corporation or your social security number. We touched on that in a few different conversations that we've had over the last couple of years. I think we've done this for a few years now. And so we wanted to dive in a little more onto that topic. Should you start an LLC or do one of the other things? So let's get started with Miss Cassandra Spangler. Welcome, Cassandra, once again.
Thanks, Shanae. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
And it is always wonderful talking to you. And I say this every time, but you're my attorney in the music industry, and you come and you do these talks with me, and I always learn so much from them. And so a little bit of selfishness, I guess, in having these talks because I learn so much from you. So thank you so much for being willing to do that and sharing with everybody out there.
Sure. Happy to do it.
So today's topic, we decided to do. We're going to talk about LLCs, and that is, correct me if I'm wrong, limited liability. Is it company or corporation?
Company.
Company. Okay, so limited liability company, and whether or not that is the way you should go if you're in the music industry and you're making some money from your music. I'm going to let you run with it, Cassandra, because you're the expert. But maybe I'll set it up with, why would someone go with setting up an LLC versus all the other options that they have? Because an LLC actually does cost some money.
It does. Yeah. And depending on which state you're in, it can be significantly more expensive to set up an LLC than a corporation. An LLC, it's kind of a newer type of an entity. It used to be your only options were pretty much sole proprietorship, partnership, or a corporation. And then they kind of developed this, it's almost like a hybrid type of entity, which is an LLC, which, as Janae said, is a limited liability company. And what it does is, from a legal perspective, really the main benefit that you get from it is it limits your personal liability. So if you are doing business and for some reason, you get sued or you have some other type of liability that you incur, as long as you're keeping everything separate and you're doing it all within the LLC, then they cannot, for the most part, sue you for any personal assets. So if you own a house, cars that you own, things like that, are separate from the business. Whereas if you're operating as a sole proprietorship or a partnership, then your personal assets are also at play. So if you get sued in the business context and you're operating as a sole proprietorship or a partnership, they can take your house, basically. So that's a really big protection that an LLC will give you. A corporation will give you that same protection, but an LLC is a little bit more flexible, especially if you have, one, two, three owners. It's easier, it's less formal than a corporation. A corporation may be better if you're planning to have, 100 shareholders who all own a stake in the company, then you may want to go with a corporation. But if you're just an individual or a small group of people, then you may find it easier to use an LLC. Some states do not allow you to have a single member LLC, which is where it's just owned by one person, but most states do allow it.
Oh, I didn't realize that some states didn't allow you to have a single party. LLC. So by default, those people in those states, they don't really have the option. Is that right? Or do they have to think of a creative way to make that happen?
They should still have the option of a corporation, but just not an LLC.
Now, in your experience, I do you see most people, setting up LLCs for the music industry or just using their Social Security numbers or something else?
Yeah, nowadays a lot of artists or producers will set up an LLC. And, in addition to the limited liability, which from a legal perspective, anyway, is really the main benefit that you get, it also, looks a little bit more professional sometimes. You're putting contracts in the name of the LLC, it maybe looks a little bit more official. And there can also be tax benefits, which is something that I don't give tax advice. So it's something that you would want to run by your accountant, anyone out there who's interested in setting up an LLC, but there can be tax benefits to it, which is also one of the differences between an LLC and a corporation. Depending on what type of a corporation you have, you may be taxed at the corporate level or you may be taxed at the individual income level or both. So that's a big consideration that I would say to anybody thinking about setting up an LLC or a corporation. Definitely speak with your accountant and figure out which one makes the most sense for you tax wise.
If we talk about people that are independent artists, and let's pretend you have a distribution through CD Baby or TuneCore or what's the other one? I always forget.
DistroKid.
Thank you, DistroKid. When you set up your profile with them, is it important to start with an LLC at that level, or does it not really matter?
It's better to do it sooner, rather than later. You can do it at any point. It just becomes more complicated the longer you wait because you have to then, if you start out doing it all in your individual name and then you want to transfer things to your LLC, there's more paperwork that's involved. You have to switch over the account to your LLC. Same thing applies if you have an account with ASCAP or BMI. A lot of people like to use the LLC for their publisher account. So if you've already set it up in your individual name, you have to go through and transfer everything. If you have copyrights or trademarks that you have registered in your individual name, you may want to transfer those over to your LLC. So you can do it at any time. It's never too late, really, but it's just the sooner you do it, the less administrative work that you'll have to do to transfer everything over.
And again, the biggest benefit, aside from the tax piece, is that you are protected in a lot of ways.
Right, right. It helps to really protect your individual assets. So for most people, probably the biggest asset, if you own a house, that'll be your biggest asset that you want to protect, and you don't want some kind of lawsuit, related to your music to end up then the person who is suing you takes your house, which would be kind of the worst case scenario. And sort of along the same lines, some artists, when they get to a certain level, they even like to set up multiple LLCs. So a lot of artists will have, for example, one LLC that they use for their recordings, a separate LLC that they use for publishing, a separate LLC that they use for touring, and then a separate LLC that they use for merchandise. And the reason for that goes back to this idea of limited liability. So, touring, for example, there can be a lot of liability on tours if a fan in the audience gets hurt or the artist cancels a concert. There can be a lot of financial liability there. So if you're doing it all through separate LLCs, then in theory, if you get sued for something that happens on tour, they can't try to take your publishing money or your recording income as long as you have segregated everything out and kept everything separate.
So, as usual, okay, so you just brought up something that I didn't even think about because in my mind, I'm going, all right, well, the only reason you'd get sued is for maybe copyright infringement, but that's just not the case.
Yeah, and same thing, merchandise can sometimes have a lot of liability if it, some type of a product that you're selling with the artist name on it and someone gets hurt by the product, things like that can happen. So to the extent that you can separate it out, it may be, it may protect you. But for artists who are just starting out, that can be a little bit overwhelming saying, oh, you need to set up 4 separate LLCs. So I don't think, if you're just starting out, you don't necessarily need multiple LLCs, but it's something to think about at some point. And there can also be tax benefits there as well. If, let's say, you're earning a ton of money on touring, but you're taking a loss with the recording side, then you would want to speak to your accountant or your business manager and figure out if that may also be a reason to separate out those LLCs.
And yeah, realistically, if you're just starting out, it not only is it daunting paperwork wise, but again, back to that expense. Typically, and tell me if I'm wrong, it's about $500 a year, correct?
It varies a lot by state. So, New York, for example, where I practice, LLCs are much, much, much more expensive than corporations. The reason being, to form an LLC in New York is a two-step process, whereas a corporation is just one step. And the second step of the LLC process is what gets very expensive. If you've ever noticed in the back of the newspaper, they'll have these listings that are called fictitious name statements. And it's basically just a listing that, you know, uh, Jane Doe is intending to form an LLC under this name, and it has to be published in the newspaper for 6 weeks. It's really just a legal formality. Why they require it for LLCs and not corporations, I don't know, but that gets very, very expensive. So in New York, particularly any of the 5 counties that make up New York City, you're looking at around $1,500 just in filing fees for an LLC versus a corporation, which I think is $200. So a significant price difference. Some other states where it's just a one-step process for LLCs are much less expensive. Some states, as Janae mentioned, you have to pay a fee every year. Other states, it's just a one-time fee. So those are all considerations that you would want to take into account when you're thinking of setting up an LLC and whether you want to do that or a corporation and which state you want to form it in and all these different types of considerations.
So, are you able to set up an LLC in a state that you don't actually reside in?
You can, although technically you need to set it up wherever you're doing business. So a lot of people have this idea that they should set it up in Delaware because that's where all the big corporations are formed and there are tax reasons for that. But the reality is that, unless you're a huge corporation, it's really not going to help you and it may actually hurt you because if you live in, say, New York and you formed your LLC in Delaware, you now have to then register in New York as a foreign LLC. So it can actually become more expensive and more of a headache. So that's a little bit of a misconception that some people have.
And in terms of setting up an LLC, is that something that you would think that you just average person could do on their own, or would you recommend them going through an attorney or some specialist?
I would recommend doing it through an attorney, just because the initial paperwork is usually pretty simple, the forms that you file with the state. But then you also want something called an operating agreement, which in some states is required. In New York, for example, it's required by law that every LLC have one. And what it is, it's basically a contract between all of the members of the LLC, which, by the way, owners of LLCs are called members. So all of the members of the LLC will have an operating agreement that specifies who owns how much, what the procedures are, what needs to be voted on, what type of records need to be kept. All of these different administrative things will be laid out in the operating agreement. So I would recommend having that drafted by an attorney, especially if there's more than one owner of the LLC, because you want to make sure the operating agreement says what you want it to say as far as what happens if, somebody one of the members wants to leave or you want to bring in a new member. All of those types of things can get a little bit complicated.
So, if I were to look at my situation, I'm pretty much on my own. I mean, I do have a producer, Mike, but I own everything and control everything. So, in my case, I would be a single member LLC.
That's right. Yep.
Okay. Now, let's do a group versus a two, jumping two and then more than two, because I kind of feel like a group is a group. It doesn't matter whether it's two or more. I could be wrong.
That's right. Yep.
Okay. So a group of people, say a band, is formed and they want to set up an LLC for the band. How would that look different from my situation? Besides, I mean, I understand like I'm it. So all the decisions get made by me and all that good stuff. But for a band, it would be different, I would think. It sounds like there should be more considerations for a group versus a single person.
Yeah, because when it's a single member, as you said, you make all the decisions. So a lot of the important parts of the operating agreement deal with decision making. So if it's just one person, then, it's really just a formality because you're making all the decisions. Also, ownership percentages. If you're the only owner, obviously you own 100%. But if it's a group, you would want to figure out, do you want to split ownership equally? Or do you want to have one person who is maybe funding most of the band's expenses? Maybe they get a higher percentage of ownership. And that can also make a difference when it comes to decision making and voting, whether you want certain decisions to require a unanimous vote or a majority vote. That can end up making a difference, especially if it's a group of more than two. That would be the difference between, let's say it's a four-person band. Do you need three of the four to agree on something, or do you want all four to have to agree? And those types of things can make a big difference later on down the line. Another thing that you can do with LLCs, so as I mentioned, owners are called members. You can also have what they call managers. So if you have a situation where you have, a silent partner or somebody who is investing money, but you don't want them to have control over the business, then you can structure the LLC in a certain way where there are managers who are members that are decision making members, basically. And then there are non manager members who are putting money into the company and own a percentage of the company but don't have any decision making rights. So that can also be helpful if you're in a situation with a silent partner or something like that. That's another benefit of how you can structure an LLC. But also another reason why, especially in that scenario, you would want to go to an attorney to make sure that the operating agreement is drafted in that way.
Yeah, you just read my mind. I'm going, aha. And that is why you go to an attorney, because who knew, right?
Right.
Most music attorneys can handle setting up an LLC. Is that correct?
Yes, but you do want to make sure because it's so state specific, you want to make sure that it's somebody in your state. And you also want to be careful. A lot of times people use, LegalZoom or these other services. I would say just be careful because I know, for example, as I mentioned in New York, it's a two-step process. And I've had a lot of people that have used LegalZoom and they only do the first step and they don't even know that they need to do the second step, and then you can run into problems that way. So just verify, if you do use a service like that, make sure they're doing the full process from start to finish.
So if we go back to the fact that when most people start off, and again, I use myself as an example, I just use it my name. I did not set up an LLC or even a sole proprietorship. And so you're saying that you would just transfer everything over to the LLC. So that then would affect things like if they're cutting checks for your royalties, it goes now to the name of the LLC versus your name, correct?
Correct. Yep. And that brings up an important point. which is dealing with the money and bank accounts. So you want to make sure that you have a separate bank account for the LLC and that any money that's coming in from the music is going into that LLC bank account, and any expenses that you're paying for should be coming from that bank account. If you do have an LLC, you don't want to start mixing up, using your personal account to pay for business expenses or having the checks coming into your personal account, because if you start doing that, then you can lose that limited liability, which is, the whole purpose of setting up the LLC.
And so and I can imagine people are going, "Yeah, but then how do I use the money for my personal stuff?" I assume you can pay yourself.
Right. Yep. Yep. You can pay yourself. You just want to keep track of it. Make sure the money initially comes in from ASCAP or TuneCore, wherever it's coming from. Make sure it's paid into the LLC bank account, and then you can pay yourself from there. Just make sure you keep a record of it.
Do you ever recommend that somebody not bother with an LLC?
I would say, if you can set up an LLC or even a corporation, if an LLC is more expensive and you don't have the budget, you can do the corporation instead. But it's really a good idea to do it if you can, just for that protection, especially if it's a group, because what can end up happening is whoever in the band has the most personal assets, and if there's a lawsuit and there's liability and the band is not operating as an LLC or a corporation, then let's say one band member owns a house, that band member is going to end up probably being the one paying the entire judgment from the lawsuit if the other band members don't have many assets. So you want to be especially careful. It's one thing when it's just you and you kind of know and you're aware of the risks. It's another thing when it's a group of four, band members, and suddenly whichever one has the best financial situation is taking on all the liability.
Can you talk at all about a situation where somebody started off just doing the regular thing and then switched over? Do you have any examples of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's, basically what you would want to do from a copyright and a trademark perspective is just a simple document transferring over ownership from the individual to the LLC. As far as, TuneCore, DistroKid, ASCAP, that gets a little bit more complicated. I don't know if they allow you to change the account from an individual to an LLC, or if you have to set up a whole new account and move everything over to it. Yeah, so that can get a little bit more complicated.
Anything else in that regard?
Again, the main benefit there is it helps to limit the liability in case of a suit, and also if you're hiring people and you have employees, there can be liability there as well. So that would be another reason that you would want to have the LLC, copyright lawsuits, trademark lawsuits, those kinds of things. So, and you can start out with one, and then as you grow as an artist and as business expands into these different areas, you may at some point want to set up a separate LLC for touring and recording and publishing and all of these different types of things that you're doing.
And you've said a couple of times about the trademark, which we touched on in another conversation. If you are setting up an LLC, do you recommend that's the time to also do a trademark?
Yeah, that's a good point. So sometimes people name the LLC something that is just completely arbitrary and not related to their business. But if you are naming the LLC something that you plan to use as the brand name, then yeah, you definitely would want to register the trademark around the same time. This way, you don't end up with an LLC that has a name that you can't trademark because someone else already has it. So it's a good idea to check and see if anyone has, when you're thinking about what you want to name the LLC, it's a good idea to also do a trademark search and make sure that that name isn't something someone else has already trademarked.
So now that brings me to yet another thing. When you're naming your LLC, do you have a recommendation? Should it be, if possible, if it's a single person, their name? So if it was me, I would say Janae Giddens LLC. Or do you recommend making up something? instead of using your name.
Yeah, some people recommend making something up, just so that it's harder to find you in a sense. So if somebody has liability and they're trying to track down the name of your LLC to file a lawsuit, if it's under your legal name or the name of the band, it's very easy to find it. If it's under some arbitrary other name, it's just one extra step. I mean, ultimately, they probably still will find it if they look hard enough, but it's just one extra step that makes it a little bit more difficult for people to do that. And also, along those same lines, you want to be cautious about what address you're using. If you're using your home address, just keep in mind that that's public now and people go and search for your LLC and then they see your home address. So, just be careful with that as well.
Yeah, and can't you use register an address, like, say, an attorney's address, or,
Right.
there's services out there that you can actually use their address, I thought,
Yep.
so that your identity is a little more protected. And I thought that the reason that you needed to put an address is because in case there is legal documents that need to be served, this is where it goes. Um, and it needed to be something that somebody was going to be there during regular business hours
That's exactly right.
versus you're touring the world and nobody's ever going to be there.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot to think about there. And I can imagine people listening and going, "Okay, that's way too complicated. I don't want to do that." But it you'd be kicking yourself, I guess, if you didn't do it and something came up and there say was a lawsuit for whatever reason. Much better to be safe than sorry, I think, in this case.
Yeah. And it sounds complicated, but it's actually, especially if it's just one person, it's a pretty simple process. That's what LLCs were created for. So I mentioned it's kind of a hybrid. It was intended for, small groups of people or one person that wanted to have an easy way to set up a formal company without needing to do a corporation, which can get a lot more complicated. Not It's easy to set up a corporation, but then it can get very complicated to keep track of all the things that you need to keep track of, whereas an LLC is a little bit more flexible. So really once you've, done the initial filing and the operating agreement, then you're pretty much good to go. And you may just have every year, where New York is every 2 years, where you just file a very simple form and pay a fee, which varies by state. But in New York, I think it's $5 or something very minimal every 2 years. So it sounds complicated. There's a lot of considerations that go into it, but it's not as daunting as it sounds, and it really is a good thing to do to protect yourself, especially if you're an artist with a day job. You don't want your salary from your day job to be at risk because of something that happens with the music. Um, so it's a good thing to do.
Good point. Yeah. I'm trying to anticipate questions that people might have, and I kind of feel like we covered everything.
I think we touched on most everything. Sometimes you may, in the music business, you hear these phrases: loan out company, furnishing company, holding company. And those are really referring to usually LLCs or corporations. But so if anyone out there hears those phrases, that's a lot of times what they're referring to is an LLC or a corporation that an artist has set up to use, to basically do all their business through.
Wow, so if you're looking for a big name person, you're probably not going to find them under their name, although you might. I think that we have covered everything that we intended to cover about LLCs. If people have questions, of course, you can always make a comment and we will do our best to get the answer to you. If you liked this conversation, let us know that as well. Cassandra, thank you so much for always being available for these talks. I learn so much from you every time, and I know that people out there learn from you as well, and I know that they appreciate your time as well. Can you give us the way to contact you if people need some help with their LLCs or anything related to the music industry, how can people get in touch with you?
Absolutely. Yeah, the easiest way is my website, which is www.cspanglermusiclaw.com. And from there, you'll be able to find my email, phone number, social media. Everything is on there. So again, it's cspanglermusiclaw.com.
Perfect. And we will be doing another conversation, hopefully very soon, to follow up with this one. And we'll let you know when that is. I guess you'll know because it'll suddenly appear. Thanks again, Cassandra.
Thank you so much, Janae. Always, I appreciate you taking the time to have me on. And thanks again. Yeah, we'll talk soon.
Excellent. Thank you for listening to my conversation with music attorney Cassandra Spangler. Don't forget to check out the links below and our previous conversations. If you enjoyed the content, please subscribe to my channel and give the conversation a like. Also, feel free to comment. And now, get going and create to your heart's content.